Hey, what is up guys, it is RB Hardware, and in today's video we're gonna build the best Ryzen gaming mini PC under $1,500 that you can get in 2021. Now we're gonna go over the whole building process from start to finish, and we're then gonna fire up the PC and we're going to look at what kind of frame rate you can expect in case you decide to build this PC. Now if you find anything you like, all items are linked up down below. Now at $1,422 to be specific, you'll be able to run most games at 4K resolution with respectable frame rate, and in many cases you will see over 100 FPS with ultra settings at 1440p, which is just insane graphics performance at this price point. Now inside this particular PC we find a high clocked Ryzen 5000 processor that actually trade blows with Intel's TP Top 10 900K processor, but at half the price. For RAM we're gonna pair the 6-core beast of a processor with 16GB DDR4 memory sticks from Corsair, and for the rest of the system we find 1TB SSD, a Radeon RX big Navi graphics card, and all contained in this awesome small form factor mini ITX case from Fractal Design. Anyway guys, timestamps can be found down below. Before we get started, be sure to drop a comment, let me know what you thought about the video, drop a like if you enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. So let's start with our motherboard coming in at $179. So for today's build I chose the B550i Aorus Pro AX. This is a top of the line high quality B550i motherboard that is fully compatible with the all new 5th gen Ryzen Zen 3 CPUs. Now the Pro AX comes with a BIOS flash button, so in case you have to update your motherboard BIOS, you actually don't need a compatible CPU in the socket. All you need is just a USB stick with the latest available BIOS on it. Anyway, this Gigabyte board has all the bells and whistles you could ever ask for, including 8 phases with 90 amperes, so you could in theory run even the most badass Ryzen processor here without problems. We also find addressable RGB, support for USB 3.2, we find dual M.2 slots with heat shield, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, Intel Wi-Fi 6 with Bluetooth 5, a high-end sound chip, and a total of 5 USB ports. Now for our CPU for today's build, I went with AMD's brand new 5th gen Zen 3 based Ryzen 5 5600X. This blazing fast 6-core and 12-thread CPU is the fastest and best budget gaming processor on the market right now, with performance that beats even Intel's best performing and most expensive processors out there. Taking a quick look at some gaming benchmarks, we see that the 5600X actually trade blows with both the much more expensive 10-core 10900K, but it even beats Intel's latest 10th gen 10700K in Death Stranding. And in Gears 5, the 10900K actually gets beaten by a few FPS, believe it or not. Even in Metro Exodus, the $300 5600X is dominating the field. Anyway, the Ryzen 5 5600X has a base clock of 3.7 and a 4.6 GHz boost clock, and installing the processor is actually very easy. You wanna locate this golden triangle, and this lines up with a triangle on our motherboard socket. You simply wanna turn the CPU so that the triangles match up. Open the metal arm, drop the processor into the socket. Put the metal arm down and our CPU is installed. For the CPU cooler for today's build, I picked the cooler that comes provided with our CPU. Now while this heatsink doesn't offer the best thermals and noise levels among all the CPU coolers available, it is still perfectly good enough for gaming in a case with good airflow. Here's what the system sounds like running Battlefield 5 maxed out with ray tracing set to ultra. As we can see, our motherboard comes with a retention frame pre-installed, but since we're using a cooler with springs rather than retention clips, we need to remove the retention frame from the board. With the retention frame removed, ensure that the backplate remains in position with the holes on the motherboard. Now, if this is the first time you're installing the CPU cooler, it may already have some thermal grease pre-applied, and in that case, you don't need to apply thermal grease on the CPU lid. Position the CPU cooler so that the 4 spring screws on the heatsink align with the 4 screws holes on the backplate, and because of the way that the cooler is designed, there is actually only one way to install it. So before placing the cooler over the CPU, make sure that the AMD text is on the opposite side of the DIMM slots. Then you wanna gently remove this small frame around the heatsink, and this is actually a necessary step to take, otherwise there won't actually be enough clearance for the RAM sticks. Now the frame, guys, is only there for the aesthetic and won't have any impact on the cooling or the acoustics. Anyway, once you have aligned the cooler over each pinhole, you want to carefully place the heatsink onto the CPU. Using a screwdriver, turn each spring screw half a turn clockwise to ensure the spring screw makes a connection with the backplate. Follow a diagonal pattern across the CPU cooler, further tightening each spring screw with a full turn. With all spring screws connected to the backplate, tighten them until you feel resistance. Then you want to check the CPU cooler to ensure that it's properly secured to the motherboard. Lastly, we connect the fan power cable on the CPU cooler to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. The only thing missing now is our RAMs, and for today's build I ended up picking these top of the line, highly popular 16GB Vengeance LPX RAM sticks from Corsair. Now 16GB is more than enough for modern gaming, and it was only, I think it was last year, that a bunch of games started to recommend that you had 12GB of RAM installed, and so 16GB is definitely future proof. Now this 3200MHz kit I chose for today's build will give you a bit more of a frame rate boost versus using a slower clocked RAM, as the way that the CPUs work, having a faster clocked RAM can gain a bit of performance in your favorite game. Simply pull back the clips and simply plug them in just like so. Now it is time to install our motherboard in our chassis. For today's build, we're gonna go with the Fractal Design Node 304, coming in at $93. This mini ITX case offers great airflow for having such a compact, minimalistic footprint, and this is much thanks to a well thought out modular interior. We find a wide, elegant and aesthetically pleasing aluminum front with air intakes at the top and at the bottom. 3 silent Sirius R2 fans comes pre-installed. The case also comes with a fan controller that lets you run the fans in 3 separate steps of 5, 7 and 12 volts. We also find filtered air intakes, but perhaps what I like the most about this case is again its modular design that allows for great airflow, and where you get, with just a flip of button, get to choose between low noise or high airflow. And here's what the system sounds like running the pre-installed fans in its highest to lowest profiles. Now usually if you've ever built in a mini ITX PC case before, you quickly realize how much you actually miss building in a bigger PC case because of the nature of a smaller form factor. There is simply not a whole lot of clearance between each component, but I have to say, with the Node 304, Fractal has somehow made you feel like you're building in a much bigger enclosure, which, yeah, in my opinion, makes this PC case the perfect first time mini ITX PC build experience. Yeah, with that said, let's install a motherboard, and in order to get access to the inside of our chassis, all we need to do is untie these 4 thumb screws, and then we can take up the top cover. By having the CPU cooler already installed, we can just grab onto the CPU cooler and gently slide the motherboard into place. Now we're gonna use the motherboard screws that comes with our Fractal case, and with the motherboard installed and secured, before we install our power supply, graphics card and storage, I figured this would be a good time to install our chassis cables that takes care of the front panel audio, the USB as well as the power button. So let's start with USB 3. This is a white connector and it's located right next to the DIMM slots. Because of the nature of the small form factor, there is not a whole lot of clearance here, guys, so you might want to take out the RAM sticks to get a bit more space. Then simply just plug it in just like so. Next up we got front audio. This one is located at the left side corner. Lastly, we got front panel audio connectors, and this can be a bit tricky guys, but don't sweat it, just take your time. And you find these connectors right next to the USB connector, right next to the DIMM slots. Now for our power supply for today's build, I picked up this Corsair CX 650M 650 watt unit coming in at $95. This is a high quality power supply that comes with 80 plus bronze efficiency certification and semi-modular cables for easy cable management. Now, I have used this particular model in several of my PC builds in the past, and the CXM series never fails to disappoint. With top of the line performance, low noise and quality components, ensure that your components run safe, and if you ever decide to, let's say, overclock your CPU or graphics card later down the road, yeah, you have some headroom for that as well. As we are installing our power supply, you want to make sure that you got the fan facing downwards and you gently slide it into place and secure it. Now we're gonna need to connect these 3 additional cables to our power supply for today's build, and the first one is the PCIe connector for our graphics card, the second is SATA power for storage, and lastly we find this Molex connector to power the fan controller. Simply take each cable and plug it onto the back of the power supply just like so. Now we need to plug this in, and first up we got the 24-pin connector that powers the motherboard. This one goes to a connector located to the left. Next we got the 8-pin power for our CPU, and this one goes all the way up to the top left side corner. Now I figured it's a good time to install our SSD, and for today's build I ended up picking the Kingston A400 with 960GB of storage. Now while this isn't the fastest SSD out there guys, it still offers a great mix between price and performance. The mechanical hard drive is also an option, however while this will give you more storage per dollar, your system will feel a lot slower and less snappy versus a flash based solid state drive. 960GB is enough to fit a few games, and you can always upgrade to more storage later down the road, as both the case and the motherboard has room for up to 4 mechanical hard drives or SSDs. Also have the option of installing an M.2, and the motherboard offers 2 M.2 slots here. In order to install our SSD, we're gonna use one of these 3 hard drive brackets where up to 2 SSDs or hard drives can be installed. We're gonna need 4 small screws that comes provided from our chassis. Secure the SSD and make sure that the ports are lining up with the bracket. Plug in the SATA cable that comes provided with our Aorus motherboard, as well as the SATA power connector coming from our power supply, and make sure to connect the SATA cable to the motherboard. Time to install a graphics card, and for today's build we're gonna use AMD's brand new Radeon RX 6800 Big Navi graphics card coming in at $579. And based on the RDNA 2 architecture, this card offers stellar 4K gaming performance, and in some cases this card is actually on par with the much more expensive RTX 3080. Keep in mind that the card can only take 2 PCIe slots, otherwise it won't be able to fit inside our chassis. So in order to install a graphics card, make sure you have enough clearance first and foremost, and simply slide in the graphics card just like so. Then connect these to the dual 8-pin PCIe connectors on a graphics card, and that's it guys. Now we're done, and with this whole PC installment completed, I like to spend a few minutes on cable management before I put the top cover back in place. You want to spend a few extra minutes here making sure that there is no cable blocking or preventing air, blowing over the CPU or GPU. And this is important to make sure that our components always performs at its intended performance to prevent potential throttling, which otherwise can be a common problem in a smaller form factor PC enclosure. Then put the top cover back, and the moment is here. It is time to turn on our system, and hopefully if you did everything right, yeah, it should power on. Alright, so time for some gaming, guys, and first up we have Battlefield 5 running at ultra settings at 1080p, and as we can see the 6800 is only a few FPS lower than the much more expensive RTX 3080. However, as we can see, we see a fairly low 1% lows for the 6800. This might be driver related issues and might get fixed later down the road. At 1080p, the $499 RTX 3070 is about 17% slower than the 6800. But yeah, it is also $80 cheaper. Now at 1440p, the gap between the 6800 and the 3070 grows to 23% as we're getting more GPU bound. And at 4K, we see that the 6800 is about 19% faster than the 3070 and 16% slower than the 3080. Moving on to control, where the 6800 once again shows respectable frame rate. And as we can see, it is sitting safely between the 3070 and the 3080. Gears 5 is up next, where we once again find the 6800 right between the 3070 and the 3080 regardless of resolution. Ghost Recon Breakpoint is next, and here we're running the game at ultra settings using the Vulkan API, where the 6800 shows healthy numbers even at 4K resolution, and with 16GB of GDDR6 memory you don't have to worry about running out of video memory. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another game running on Vulkan, but in this game the distance to the 3070 is much smaller with only a few FPS difference at 4K, where the 6800 for the first time has a hard time reaching that magic 60 FPS mark. However, both Metro Exodus and Division 2 runs great on the 6800 even at 4K, which tells us that for the most part you're able to run your favorite game at 4K maxed out while still averaging 60 FPS. Yeah, that is just insane price to performance. Before we conclude the benchmark, guys, let's quickly have a look at Ray Tracing 2. And if you have been following the rumors around Big Navi, there has been quite a few rumors suggesting that AMD was gonna be a bit behind Nvidia here, and that does seem to be the case. And as we can see, running Battlefield 5 regardless of resolution, the 6800 is about 20 to 22% slower than the 3070. This seems to be true for Metro Exodus as well. And so what we can say so far is that AMD is falling a bit behind Nvidia when it comes to ray tracing, and so if that is important to you, as of the time being, you should pick the green team. But yeah, if you rather pick the best overall performing graphics card for its price tag and don't really care about ray tracing, the 6800 offers unbeatable price to performance at $579. All PC components we just looked at can be found down below. I'm starting up a Discord server, guys, and it would be fantastic if you guys wanted to join. And here you can discuss PC builds and issues and pretty much everything in between. So I'm going to hang out there and answer any questions you guys might have. So you definitely want to join at the Discord server. Link to the Discord can be found down below. Now watch either of these two videos and I will see you guys in the next video.